Hi, it's Brian Timoney here, and welcome onto today's show. Now, on today's show, we're going to be delving deep into the unconscious mind. Yeah, we're going to get our hands dirty and talk about what's going on in your mind up here. So let's go to the first question.
Could you share some tips on how to overcome self-consciousness and gain more confidence in acting? At K8Dunn.
Okay, so how do you overcome self-consciousness? It's a really good question, this, and it's really all to do with what happens in your mind when you are working as an actor. Because what happens is that there can be an element of fear that creeps in, because self-consciousness is really about fear of failure. It's about fear that you're going to get something wrong or you're going to be perceived in a certain way. So you start to actually get really involved with yourself. Which is not really what we want, because you should be involved with the character that you're playing rather than yourself. So the first thing is to kind of get out of your own mind, and get into the mind of the character. Now, it's easy to say that, right? And I've heard this, I've heard directors say this, I've heard different acting teachers say this, you just got to get into the mind of the character, live in their shoes. It's not even quite as simple as that. And it's easy to say it, but how do you do it? And part of it is that you have to kind of work with the unconscious mind, because what we're trying to do is release that part of you so that you don't need to think about it anymore. It just starts to naturally happen. So part of it is really beginning to relax, because self-consciousness, it's all about, starting to tense up and starting to worry, and the body actually physically tenses, the mind tenses, and it becomes harder and harder to work. So what we do in the method is that we have various exercises and ways of combating this, one of which is sense memory. So this is the ability to work with your senses in conjunction with your memory. And we look at, you work on something specific that you think is going to help you go into that particular scene. So for example, instead of walking onto set or walking on stage and thinking, you know what, look at all these people that are here to see me. I hope that I get this right, or I better not mess this up. It'll be embarrassing. You start to kind of work on a memory or an experience from your own past that will help release the kind of emotion that's required for the scene, or at least the experience for that scene. Because not every scene requires a huge emotional reaction or experience, but it does require you to be relaxed and concentrated. And again, sense memory will allow you to do that. And depending on what you have to do will depend on the sense memory you pick. Some might be very simple and easy. Some will be maybe more complicated than that. Also, a good relaxation technique is required. Within the method, we use a thing called basic relaxation, and we do it seated in a chair, just like this. And the reason that we do it seated in a chair is you don't want to be completely relaxed, because completely relaxed would be you lying down and kind of falling asleep, which is not what we want. We want you still to be alert and to be conscious and to be able to work. So we do it seated in a chair, but it begins to kind of work you from head to toe physically, and also begins to make you conscious and aware of what's happened to you mentally. Because you've got to remember, before you start work, whether it be in an audition or whether you're going to work on set or on stage, there's a transition that needs to happen from when you walk into that rehearsal room or theatre or set, from being off the street, just walking in off the street that day, into that environment. There needs to be a transition that happens. So doing this process really helps that to work. And I guess on a psychological level, if you're able to just let go, because part of the self-consciousness comes from control. So you're trying to control the environment, you're trying to control your own performance, maybe even trying to control the other actors and what they're trying to do. But when you begin to let go, those sort of worries and concerns dissipate. And therefore, you become more free in your work, and you can work more, unconsciously. So there we go. That's the answer to that quite deep question. And at the end of the day, it's a combination of practical exercise and also the way that you approach it psychologically. Okay, so let's move on to the next question.
What's the difference between theatre and film performances, and what advice do you have? Aaron von Andrien.
Okay, so what's the difference between theatre and film performance? Great question. Now, there's so much that we can discuss within these two mediums of theatre and film. Where to begin? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk from a practical perspective for the actor working in these two mediums. And I'm going to focus on one particular area because I think it's the main area that is the biggest difference between the two. It's where the audience is and how close they are to you. Because when you think about it, in theatre, You could be working in the West End, and there's like a 5,000-seater auditorium, and you have to be able to reach the person at the furthest away point in that auditorium. They need to hear you, they need to feel you, etc. Now, the skills required for that are different from when you are working on film. So where is the audience when you're working on TV or film? Well, they can be that close. I mean, literally this close, because the camera can go into close-up. And basically, that is where the audience is. They're that close to your face. Now, if you look at this, if you actually look at how close my hand is to my face, I mean, in close-up, that's where they are. So if you were to imagine somebody walking right up to your face and looking straight into your eyes and looking straight at you, how would you perform then? It's very different from if you're performing in a 5,000-seater auditorium. So the main thing that you have to be aware of as an actor is, where is the audience? Because if the camera's that close and that's where your audience is, the slightest thought can pass across the eyes and be picked up. Whereas if you're doing that in theatre, that won't be the case, because they're not that close enough to see that sort of detail. So you need to think in other levels, such as physicality and the use of voice as well. So what I would say to you is, whatever medium that you're working on, whether it be TV, film, and theatre, the first thing that you should start to think about is, where is the audience? How close are they to me? And that will help you moderate the level of your performance. Okay, let's go to the next question.
I've always wanted to do acting, but I've no experience. I wondered if you had any tips on how to get started. Anonymous.
Okay, so it's this old chestnut again, I don't have any experience, and how do I get started in the acting industry? Right, okay, well, the first thing you should remember is that every single actor that you might care to mention, all the ones that you hold in high regard, all started off at some point with no experience. Yes, it's true, once upon a time, Meryl Streep had no experience. Al Pacino had no experience. Daniel Day-Lewis at one point had no experience. The list is endless of actors with no experience. So the good thing to acknowledge here is that you are starting at the exact same point that every other actor has been at some point in their career. So the question is, how do you get past that point? Well, if we look at them, for example, what did they do? And what does every other actor do? Well, usually at some point they decide to take to the stage, or they get in front of a camera. They decide to test it out. They decide to become part of it. Now, sometimes that can go as far back as a school play, or it could just be they get involved in an amateur dramatics group, or they know a friend that is doing some, a short film or something like that, and they get involved. So the first thing I would recommend is that you get involved in some shape or form. Amateur dramatic groups are good for that. I'd say in the long term, it's not somewhere that you want to stay long term if you want to become a professional, because ultimately you'll pick up bad habits from amateurs. And, if you want to be a professional, you need to be aware of that. They do work completely differently. But it's a good place to start out. That's where I started. I started in Amdram groups. And you start to get a taste for it and a feel for it. But it's important that you're involved. Or maybe you go to an acting school, you take an acting class that is designed for people who are beginners or have little or no acting experience. We have, of course, the boot camp that's designed specifically for that. In fact, most of the people that I deal with initially have very little experience. So there's courses out there, there's classes out there that you can take that are designed for people that don't have that sort of experience. So that's what I recommend, is get involved, and get your hands dirty with regards to getting your first taste of acting. Then after that, there's no shortcut. You basically have to go and train, whether that be in acting school. That's it. You have to go to acting school. There is no other option, because you have to gain that professional experience and train in the craft of acting. And so therefore, you need to research that and get involved in that area, because a casting director and agent, they're going to want to know that you've trained in the art form. So therefore, that would be the next step after that. And then once you come out, you get an agent. and castings and so on. But those are the initial steps that I would recommend. So if you're in a 9-to-5 job, for example, right now, and you're thinking, how do I get started? That's what I do. Amateur dramatics, look for some acting classes and courses that are designed for beginners and people with very little acting experience. Get involved. Okay, let's go to the next question.
How do you write a cover letter when applying for auditions? Bessie Ashley.
Okay, here's a cheeky little fourth question. For those of you more observant, you'll probably notice that I always answer 3, but today we're breaking the rules. We're answering a 4th. So this question is all about, covering letters. So the short answer is covering letters should always be short. They're not interested in your life story. They don't want to know your whole history. They don't want to know all the, like pages and pages and reams in that covering letter. All they want is a short covering letter. I recommend bullet points to highlight something about yourself. For example, what parts are you good at playing, age, background, perhaps, what part of the country you come from, etc. Things like that. They just highlight very quickly to them what you're about and what they should take note of. So maybe just a very short opening couple of lines, some bullet points about yourself, and then just sign off in the normal way. So that's what I recommend for covering letters. Keep them short and sweet. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this program. As always, if you'd like to send us in a question, keep them coming. You can go to Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, send us an email, film yourself asking a question. Why don't you? Go ahead and send it in, and we will answer it. I look forward to speaking to you on the next show.